In yesterday's closing keynote, Sam reminded us of the quote, "People don't leave companies, they leave managers." But he added that they stay because of themselves. He noted that the primary reason move companies is they're not self-actualizing. As leaders, we have to be in front of developing ourselves and our team. Our next panel is on the structures we can use for this, career progression frameworks. And we have the perfect moderator to take us through this, the founder and CTO of Progression, the company behind the app and the awesome website progression.fyi. Please welcome Neil Cameron.
John, and welcome everyone to this panel. So this evening, we're going to be discussing career progression frameworks and how you can provide a clear and upward path for engineers and engineering managers. So some housekeeping before we get started. This session will be recorded. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions, please leave them in the sidebar to the right of this video. And this evening, I've got a great panel. I'm really looking forward to diving into some of the questions and the tips and the stories around frameworks. So I'm joined by Gonçalo Silva, who is CTO at Doist, Sarah Clatterbuck, who is Senior Director of Engineering at YouTube, James Goodrich, Managing Partner at Albany, search firm that works exclusively with CTOs and VPs of engineering, and Richard Haigh, CTO at Just Eat. So I want to start right at the beginning. And one question that CTOs may be asking themselves is, how do I know if I even need a framework? What are some of the signs that perhaps it's time we start thinking about one? Gonçalo, just before this, you mentioned that you've recently developed and rolled out a framework. I'd love to hear your take on this. How did you know that sort of the time was right for creating a framework and rolling one out?
We had many signs that we were dealing with. I think the signs actually span maybe 2 years back. So we're not growing very fast, which helps. It lets us take our time in advancing with these initiatives. But I think a telltale sign is, when you're spending a lot of time talking about expectations with different people around the company. If you feel like this is happening too often, maybe it might be time to align on those expectations and align on that definition of good. Another one is if you want to recognize the development of people in your team more explicitly and more consistently. Some of us are better about talking about our own growth, the things we do, than others, and having a system in place, helps level the playground. Another one is when you have a plan for the future, you have a long-term vision, and maybe you want to cultivate specific knowledge and skills that you think will be important in the future. So getting those down on paper and into a framework can be really impactful, basically. And two more things I want to mention, which were also relevant for us, is one is making coaching and mentoring a more explicit part of growth. Having a career paths framework in place is really helpful with this and helps, bring this to light. And lastly, changing careers. This can happen within companies. And when you're not in a specific role, it can be hard to understand what things you should know, what things you should be good at. Like, what's the definition of good for that specific role? Having a career path framework documented and in place helps you understand this, even if you don't have the intuition due to lack of experience of just not being in that role. So ultimately, I think it boils down to three things: the need for aligning expectations, the need for aligning on the definition of good for each role, and also providing clearer opportunities for individual growth within the team and the company.
Right, that's really interesting. And did you find that there was sort of a team size at which point it became clear that you just weren't hitting the mark on those three things, or was it down to complexity? Did either of those two things come into it?
Well, I think this is fairly contextual, so I wouldn't put a number on it. I would just look out for the signs that we were discussing, because I think depending on the team, depending on the field, depending on how we started out, how fast you're growing is also something that definitely plays a role. You might need to do this earlier than later. So for us, I think it was quite late, at least comparing to others in the industry. But again, like we grow very slowly, and being remote and fully asynchronous, we already have like a lot of documentation and communication that's well structured and in place, which I think helped align expectations beforehand and just staying fairly doing this fairly well, even without a framework. But even then, we're creating ours now. So I wouldn't look out for a number, just the signs and the need for creating this.
Yeah, that's great. And you mentioned something that actually I just wanted to touch on, which was Doist is famously remote, distributed, asynchronous. And I wonder whether that sort of makes you more inclined to create a framework. It's more in the spirit of documenting expectations. Did that sort of enter into the decision-making?
Not really. And actually, I think we might have been able to delay this further because we were remote and asynchronously, because we already had to have really good feedback loops, to have really good documentation in general, which helped us kind of like delay a more formal process. But it does definitely impact on the specific skills that a career framework looks at. So these are fairly common across companies of all shapes and sizes. But for example, written communication is paramount for us. That's the way we communicate primarily.
Right.
So it takes a front and center seat at our career framework role. Another one is independence, a person's willingness and ability to work without being blocked by others, to, ask for forgiveness, not permission, that kind of thing, have a lot of agency. This is very important when everybody is just working remotely and almost fully asynchronously. So some of these traits might be a little specific to remote and async, but generally speaking, not the timing to create the framework. I wouldn't say so.
Yeah, that's great. So I guess moving on in the process then, we've established sort of when might be the right time to roll a framework out, what things to look for. I would be really interested to explore a bit about what is the actual process like of rolling out a framework. One thing we typically hear from customers is that, yes, defining the framework is a whole bunch of work and it's hard and it takes time, but wait till you start dealing with the human side of it. Then it gets really difficult. Then you've got some harder conversations. Richard, at Just Eat, you have a very large product and engineering team, and you mentioned that you're using frameworks pretty comprehensively across the whole team. How, in your experience, has it been rolling out frameworks, and what sort of anecdotes and tips do you have around handling the human side of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think you're right. Once you've done that work and you've put pen to paper, actually rolling it out when it actually starts to touch people's lives and careers is where it really starts to get interesting. The ultimate tip I've got is try not to make it too complicated. So especially when you're looking into engineering disciplines, you can subdivide and cut this into so many different ways, so many different types of engineers, so many different types of skill sets, security, engineering, front end, back end, various things. It is very easy to end up trying to create a framework that caters to all things to all people. Now, you'll take so much time putting it together, and because of its complexity, the moment that it lands with your people, you will find you are not 100% covered, and there'll be a group, there'll be a subset that you haven't taken care of. And now your framework is a hindrance because that team sits there and says, everyone else is recognized apart from me or my skill set, why not? And now you're into that level of detail that just becomes prohibitive for you using this as a wider tool. So I think my first tip when you're rolling this stuff out is try and get it simple enough. I've tended to always start with some kind of career pathway, and ultimately this is how do we go from something that is fairly common, and ultimately in my world in tech and eventually split it into the individual contributor track where my technical skills define the levels that I take, or a management track where my ability to deliver through others and coordinate the teams defines my track. Once you've got that pathway in place, then it's, well, how do you subdivide that? How many levels of engineer do you want? Junior, mid, senior, let's say. How many levels do you want to look at? How many levels of management do you want to look at? And maybe that's particular to the size of your organization and how much distance power you need. And then once you've got that, it's, okay, now I understand this, I can turn this into a competency framework where I have the number of different levels that I have on this pathway. And then I look at the competencies to build out these role types where I'm trying to go for the minimum number that I can. So there's got to be commonality to it. But there's also got to be room for you then to turn those into flavors from those role types in that framework into hopefully what also becomes like your third set of artifacts, which is role descriptions for people in that particular world. So if we take something like an InfoSec security engineer, for example, you can say, hey, on the career pathway, we can see that you are yet to diverge. You're on an immediate track at the moment, and maybe you're somewhere senior. So as a senior, your competencies look at various levels of skills, and as a senior for an engineering track, we expect to see something evidencing the following. And then your job description, your role description itself will take that into the more tangibles. As a security engineer, you're expected to be able to evidence the following technology grasp, the following leadership skills, the following incident management. And it kind of builds out into those kind of three broad sets of artifacts, which then becomes a very natural way of telling that story to your team. Here's it at a very high level at the pathways. Here's in terms of the career competency framework we're looking at, which helps all of you find where you sit and the types of things that are expected from you. And then we can go a bit more into the detail for your teams with those role descriptions that build on top of those previous two artifacts to produce something that's more tangible to you. And I think if you get that right level of detail and that story right, that's super helpful when it comes to rolling this out into your population.
Right. That's really interesting to hear. When we think about building and releasing products, we often compare the two approaches of big bang versus being iterative. And I imagine something similar applies here to frameworks, that you could hide away in an ivory tower and create the perfect framework and then release it, or you could work iteratively. And I think you hinted at this when you talked about starting small. But I'd love to hear sort of any experiences or thoughts sort of around when is enough enough, and to what extent should you continue to iterate on the framework once it's already out?
Yeah, it's a good question, because again, getting that balance of detail versus the oversight is a difficult thing to do. I think these things are always iterative. I think in the world of tech, the skill sets change, the expectations change. You know, I'm old enough to know pre-DevOps and then DevOps, and then, you know, it just changes the way that we define development roles, operation roles, no longer a thing anymore. You know, I think you've got to do something that will iterate and change over time with your teams as they also iterate and change. And I think this is part of why I say, you know, try and start simple, try and reduce the number of moving pieces you've got, particularly in that career pathway and then into that competencies matrix. Because if that becomes too blown up and too large, when the world changes around you and you need to react, there's now a very large piece of work for you to reiterate the next version of that plan. Where if it's somewhat more structured and simple in its core, you can still lean on those core competencies, the hard skills, the soft skills, the experience levels. You can lean on those as well-defined expectations for a junior role, a mid role, a senior role, a management role, an individual contributor role, and then build them into the job frame, the role descriptions, which I think then start to iterate more and become much more salient to what does InfoSec engineering do this year compared to last year? How does it change? How does maybe our business has changed, and therefore we're looking or expecting slightly different themes out of this role? Or how is it that specialty in itself is changing, and we now need to also represent that and react to that in some of these frameworks? So I think it will change. I think it will iterate. I'm where I've done it in the past, I guess I've launched with a bit of a big bang, because you've done some of that homework, you've produced some of these artifacts, and it's kind of a, hey guys, we didn't have this before, or we had a different way of doing it. The big bang is, and now we have the competency framework. Now I can talk you through the story of that pathway through framework, through descriptions, and then you start to iterate on it. Particularly if you find, I guess, you've got a role that doesn't quite fit into particular, it kind of sits between maybe two other roles, and you decide, you know what, we didn't go into enough detail, so we'll make another track here. Or where you've got two roles that, you know, it's quite obvious we're doing similar kind of work here, actually. We could simplify this and put a single competency to cover both of these, and then just put the flavoring into the role descriptions.
Yeah, that's great. Sarah, Gonçalo, I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts on this. I know at Doist, you've just recently rolled out the framework. Sarah, at YouTube, I'm not sure how long you've been using frameworks. Have they been there since the very beginning, or if you've sort of were there during the rollout? But I'd love to hear a bit more on this sort of human side of managing that process. And any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in a company as large as YouTube, we have a well-established framework that has existed, you know, for many years prior at this point, kind of a Google-wide framework. And, you know, I think even Google went through all of these phases at one point that you're talking about, where there were no frameworks and there was a very flat organization, and that frameworks were introduced. But I think the frameworks that exist really do serve to have a conversation, as Gonçalo mentioned, around what are the expectations, how are, you know, folks performing against those expectations, how are they growing against those expectations, when will we know they're ready to take on more responsibility, that sort of thing. That's where I find the framework quite helpful in a large organization.
That's great. And Gonçalo, was there anything that surprised you when it actually came to rolling out the framework, and anything that you thought, oh, I wasn't expecting that to happen?
Yes. So some people didn't care at all. So we went into some of our growth conversations, and people were very eager to learn the feedback that was kind of like, brewing within those conversations. But then the specifics of, which levels and how that affected, salary and all of that, they're like, yeah. Let's just, move through with that. I want to know where I need to learn, where I need to grow. And the rest doesn't really concern me, which was quite interesting because it's a stark contrast to some other people who will maybe go a little bit into negotiation modes. Then those are very different experiences when you're, leading these growth conversations, having such a wide range of reactions. So I was honestly expecting both, just not that so many folks would be, not that interested in the framework itself rather than the skills and the definition. Yeah, that's really interesting. All right, so one thing that we observe when our customers are building out their frameworks is they put a lot of thought into the progression from junior to mid-level to senior and beyond. One part of the framework that is normally left until last is the most senior end. So the VP of engineering, the CTO level. James, you deal directly with this area. You are talking to potential VPs and CTOs all the time. I would love to hear your thoughts on when you get to that end of the framework, how do both yourself and managers, hiring managers, candidates think about how the competencies are different between, say, head of, VP, and CTO?
Thanks, Neil. That's a good question. So I would say title isn't a great representation of the roles and responsibilities when splitting out heads of and VPs and CTOs. It's normally determined by a CEO's agenda or what the founding team consists of. So a CEO might determine that will get a high valuation if they have a CTO at Series A, or they might be able to try to attract a candidate that needs the title for them to land. So what we see is a lot of candidates that are the titled are misrepresented. Ultimately, if you're the most senior person in a technical team reporting to a CEO, then you're performing a similar role despite your title. But in the main, for businesses that are pre-Series B, we typically only see VP of engineering and CTO titles and heads of in later stage companies. The exception to that are businesses that have a universal leadership policy where everyone's called head of, so head of finance, head of marketing, head of tech. But CEOs are often advised to hire in VPs of engineering level pre-Series B to give them headroom to hire in a CTO should that person not be able to scale or grow and they need to hire above them. But titles determined not by competency, I would say in some respects, but a jigsaw puzzle of what stands before them. All that said, our understanding of competencies of VPM, engineering, CTO, and head of, I would say as follows. So a CTO is typically outward facing, responsible for the overall technical strategy, the bridge between business investors and the technical teams, manages internal and external stakeholders, potential product ownership that's more and more common these days. But if not, very capable of creating a healthy partnership with that, someone that's strategic and visionary, and essentially a voice of technology at the executive level. So competencies there would be natural leadership qualities, good level of EQ, strategic and commercial, and stakeholder management, so strong communication. VP of engineering, I would say, is more tactical, delivery orientated, delivering against a plan, structure, process, methodology, building predictability and reliability in delivery, management of the engineers, and execution of all things engineering, and responsible for culture and engineering culture. So competencies are more technically capable, stronger management maybe versus leadership, structured and good on process and good EQ. One thing we talked about was, I know all ambitious CEOs of scaling companies can often have high expectations and are slightly challenging. A CTO with good EQ will have the ability to manage up as well as down, as opposed to a VP of engineering who's more comfortable supporting the engineers with a CTO in place. And then lastly, head of, I would say, slightly harder to answer, as generically heads of in one company might be called CTOs in others. But a head of title we see to be used in larger companies where they're looking for one aspect of engineering, so whether it's DevOps, architecture, or infrastructure. And those core competencies would include management, technically capable, and then functional technical depth in that core area.
Right, so much more of a T-shape where they have that domain expertise for head of, and beyond that it gets more and more strategic. It's interesting. I'd love to hear from the rest of the panel once you get to sort of the right-hand side of the framework into the VPs and the CTOs. Do you treat that like any other position? So Richard, Gonçalo, do you have a set of competencies against which you are growing yourself, or has that sort of fallen off the end?
So I think, in short, yes. I hold myself accountable to having a job role description the same as those that work for me. I guess the downside, the upside, is that I probably have a bit more to say in how that's written than maybe those that work for me. But it's definitely there. My role sits there along the career pathway. It's got competencies on it, and they roll up and roll into the competencies of the team that support me. So absolutely.
Great. And Sarah, do you have a column in the framework that you're sort of actively using to steer your career?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I sit within the framework and within the ladder, and I think about, if I'm evaluating roles either internally or externally, or thinking about going to the next level, what are the competencies that I want to develop, that I need to develop? What are the strengths that I have that I can leverage to explore those next opportunities, and then what are maybe the weaknesses that I need to fill in? And as you go up the ladder, a lot of times it's even kind of expanding out of your core competency. So it's being able to have product thinking, being able to deal with business development, to be able to think in a legal sense about what you're building, and so kind of interacting more with the other executive disciplines, not just with the technology and the team and the culture.
Right. Yeah. So becoming strategic within technology, but then also understanding how that impacts the other areas of the business as it becomes more senior. That's great.
Exactly.
So, Sarah, staying with you, you mentioned that at Google, frameworks have been there since, almost since the beginning, for a long time, that they're part of business as usual. How have you seen those frameworks evolve and change as you've been there? Has it been determined by the sorts of technology that's used, or by the makeup of the teams? What does that look like in a mature organization?
Yeah, so I think our thinking about the framework evolves over time, maybe in terms of what are the needs of the business in these different roles, right? So, I think especially thinking about management track versus individual contributor track, and what are the different skill sets that the very senior folks, maybe, and the very junior folks in these ladders bring to the table, and how are they different, and how should we evaluate for those roles in terms of hiring, and how should we evaluate in terms of progression. But one interesting thing I wanted to talk about was actually being in a rapidly scaling organization prior to my role at Google, which was I was at LinkedIn. And during the time that I was there, the engineering org, I think, grew from 300 to 3,000 or so. And so there we actually went from what Richard described, which was kind of this basic framework, having kind of enough but not too much, to a lot more granularity over time, and a lot more specificity over time. And so I think where we started with something like engineer, senior engineer, manager, then as the org grew and, you had a need for more than one manager, then the kind of management ladder got built out to be kind of in parallel, or we figured out where it overlapped with the individual contributor ladder. And then I also think you get a lot more specificity in terms of the actual things that you're looking for in your role descriptions over time. So when you start, it's very generalist focused. You're looking for competencies like data structures and algorithms and systems design and testing and mentoring and code reviewing as kind of these core competencies within engineering. But then over time, you actually bring in more specificity. So then you say, okay, now we need to have a front end or a UI engineer, or maybe a mobile engineer, a data scientist type of engineer. And then you have to actually think about how those specific roles and skills line up to the core competencies of the engineering ladder, and then what are the divergent points? What are the extra things that you want to focus on? Maybe in front end, it's like this person knows about accessibility and security and performance and things like that. So these were kind of the evolutions that we made during my time there. And then, we also had to start thinking about, well, at some point we hired a director of engineering, there was a ladder, but then how do you actually, promote people from manager to senior manager to director, and what's the evaluation process? And similarly, from senior engineer to staff engineer to senior staff engineer, like all of these kind of things need to be considered in terms of the progression and how you determine that kind of after the ladder has been defined.
Right. One thing some people watching this might be thinking is, how am I ever going to find time to do all of this, to build all of this stuff out? I'd love to hear, in your experience, whose job was it to do this? Did you create a cross-functional team? Did you throw it over the fence to HR to deal with? Did you bring in subject matter experts? How did you put together the team to work on this?
It was definitely a cross-functional team each time the ladder evolved or a new promotion process was defined. You would basically establish a working group. The working group would together make recommendations, and typically the working group would be, a few senior folks from different disciplines within engineering. You would then maybe have someone who was a subject matter expert in the area that you were thinking of expanding the ladder into to have more specificity. You would have probably somebody from HR, somebody from compensation, this sort of thing, and you would have a discussion and then make a recommendation to the executive team, and then
right.
And then you have to start the whole backside of the process, which is rolling it out into the organization.
Sure. And did you find that you got either solicited or unsolicited feedback of people saying, excuse me, but I feel like level 3 of software engineer 2 is not quite the right way of defining API architecture or something like that? Was there a lot of feedback that you received?
Yeah, I mean, I think the working groups would typically take 3 to 6 months to define a new ladder or something along these lines. So there would be a lot of discussion within the working group, but then you would obviously get a lot of perhaps unsolicited feedback from outside of the working group, from people who knew that this work was happening, and so it's kind of setting expectations. Well, we have all of these different functions represented in order to get a well-balanced view, and and assuring folks that their concerns will be heard.
Right. Okay, that's great. So I'm going to move over to some of the questions that have cropped up whilst we've been having this discussion. And I want to start with the juicy question of money, compensation. So the notion of having a framework implies that you have levels. Levels implies that you have salary bands. How should compensation and progression frameworks and levels all be tied together. Once you roll out that framework, are you then on a unstoppable conveyor belt of promotions and pay rises because they've met the requirements? Anyone from the panel? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So I think I can answer a little bit for some of the challenges we've seen. So yes, it does give a tool for the people team, your HR teams, to start looking at those levels and assign salary bands to them. And that can be quite useful, especially when it does come to promotions or level moves within those promotion bands within the organization, because it gives you that market benchmarking for those roles to make sure that you're compensating your employees fairly for their competencies, their skills, their experience. So I think it's a valuable tool to have. But I think it comes with a warning as well. Tech moves fast enough that you have to make sure that you're revisiting those bands fairly regularly. Some of the practices, some of the skill sets that you have in tech move and evolve faster than others. Data, as in general, has been one that has accelerated massively over the last few years relative to others. And you need to make sure that you're making that market reference check fairly often to make sure you continue to realign. If you don't, then people ultimately go and get paid more to go and work somewhere else, and you miss out on the opportunity of retaining them. The other thing that I think is very valuable as well is that those bands, those comp bands that you have, and I think they should be thought of as total reward rather than just a single dollar number. I think they need to have a level of overlap at the bottom and the top of one level into the next level into the next, because you will have some people who are exceptional in some areas within that competency and just need to brush up a little bit on some of the other competencies in order to make the jump to the next level, particularly as you go from that common track into IC or into management. And what you don't want to do is put a hard glass ceiling on their comp just because your level didn't have any flexibility in it, and force yourself into a position where either you over promote someone into a role that they're not ready for or they don't want to do purely because they want to follow that comp track. Or you end up capping people off at the role they're in and not being able to pay them market rate for the experience they got because your model doesn't allow it. So I think there's a little bit of sensitivity that you need there to kind of keep it real.
Right. That's great. Okay, next question comes up quite often in smaller teams or scale-ups, which is that how to create the career path for senior members of the team. So if you know that there is currently no vacancy for, let's say, a VP of engineering, and that the senior level is as high as it goes, how do you create the career path for those senior levels? Gonçalo, did you have any experience of this when you were creating your framework? You mentioned that the team is on the smaller side, the growth is slightly slower. How do you think about those more senior roles?
This is one of the most challenging things we have dealt with, not only because of that specific scenario of the senior person, but also because of what I said before. We grow very slowly. So these opportunities appear very rarely. Something we try to do is maybe, yes, there's no next step in the ladder for the time being, but we still want to give people more leverage in the projects that they do, in the value that they deliver, so that they can build up to the situation where this actually appears and there is an opportunity there. So unfortunately, we can't have a team of all leaders, managers. We can't have a team of all heads, but we try to make sure that people can still level up in the impact that they have and how much they grow individually, and that we are behind this and can support it. So it feels like an acceptable trade-off until those opportunities appear and people can finally move up the ladder.
Right. That's great. Okay,
Yeah.
next question.
Yes. On this one too.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think the way I look at it is I'm sort of the talent agent for the folks on the team. And so, I think in a smaller organization like Gonçalo is describing, maybe you can offer the person to work on a totally different part of the stack and learn something new that way, or try a totally different role, like try being a product manager for a while or something like that, because there's so many things that need to be done and you're kind of getting them done with a small group of people. So that could be one way you offer folks growth. But then, even in a large organization where there might be a lot more levels on the ladder, there's not always a business need for somebody of a certain level in a certain team. And so then I see it as really my job to talk to that person and be open with them and say, hey, I don't have the business need here. I think you're ready for the next level. Like, let me help you find another team or another company or another challenge where you can continue growing.
Right. I love that analogy of
Neil,
a talent agent. Yep.
Sorry, I'll be on that as well. So it's interesting. We see the other side of this. So we see where people get escalated within a business to the point where they are either CTO or founding CTO, or and they find themselves not in a role where they feel comfortable with. So people look at the ladder and think that they need to progress up the ladder, and therefore they need to do a different role, where actually the role changes so significantly when you climb up to VP of Engineering to CTO, where actually technology plays such a small part of what you're doing. It's much more about being a strategic leader, being a manager of stakeholders, being a business leader, that actually they forget what they love and what they want to do. So I think as you're bringing people through, the expectation that people want to progress their careers sometimes blinds them towards what they're actually moving into. And I think it's important to recognize that.
That's great.
Yeah, something we have thought a lot about was not making management a promotion, or at least not a direct promotion, so that, you know, there are many paths in the IC track for you to grow in parallel with managers. Because, you know, let's be honest, if you're an individual contributor, you're very talented technically, and you're offered a management position, at least for a little while, you're going to perform worse than you were in your previous role. So sometimes looking at management as a pure promotion can be a little bit misleading and misaligned with, you know, what people want, what they expect, and most of all, the impact that they have on an organization. So keeping those a little bit parallel, at least, is very, very important.
Yeah, that's great. And that leads into the next question, which is that, is the goal always to progress through the ranks? And how do you cater for people who want to stay senior, but they want to hone their craft instead of progressing up the chain? And I think Google is famous for promoting the idea of being a great individual contributor. And there's lots of stories of senior folks at Google who are have very fulfilling careers without moving into management. So I'd love to sort of hear some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we expect a pretty huge amount of scope at the senior engineer level in terms of what folks are able to handle, both technologically and organizationally. So, you know, it should be a role that would be completely satisfying to an engineer to kind of stay in as a terminal level. There should be enough there to continue to challenge folks. And so I think, you know, that's one aspect, is like there is a really nice sweet spot in our ladder at senior engineer where you don't have a lot of the organizational overhead of going up above that, or, you know, dealing with time zones, things like that. You can really just focus on your craft and continuing to grow in different areas of technology. So I think that's a really nice thing to kind of emphasize with folks, is like, hey, you can stay there. There's no expectation that you have to progress beyond this level.
Yeah. Richard, was that something you had to explicitly communicate through the frameworks, that so there is a place for you here in this team if you're happy at this level?
Yeah, it's a question I've had more than once, more than a few times. I think the important thing is telling people it's okay. I think there's this unwritten rule that if you're not in a different job or a higher grade this year than last year, that somehow you're failing in your career. And I think there are plenty, especially Sarah, I share the same, that senior level role is such a sweet spot where you can become senior following a technical track, but there is so much breadth that you can go and get richer and richer in without having to take on the burden of either management or a further individual contributor role. And I think sometimes people just need to hear that it's fine. This is still you enjoying what you're doing, getting better, learning something every day, helping influence those around you, helping mentor and support. And it's a fine thing to do. And hopefully we were talking earlier about some of that reward structure off the back of it. Hopefully you set up around those roles enough leeway that you can reward in terms of comp and etc. as much as you can in terms of interesting work to do for those who found a comfortable level for them to continue to feel like they are growing and achieving more and influencing further as well. So I think it's a very important thing, but I think it's one that I often hear missed out and not well communicated.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting that although it may be called a progression framework, progression isn't necessarily always the goal at different places within that framework. Okay, so we've got a question here, which is, how do we make growth frameworks that engineers use spontaneously and proactively, that they really want to use, so that they become a tool for the team members rather than perhaps a stick for the managers to metaphorically beat the team members with? I'll throw that one open to anyone that wants to take it.
Well, this is quite challenging. I think something that we are doing that I am quite fond of is so when these conversations are happening, there's some preparation for them. So there's a bit of a pre-work, some assessment work around the skills, and it starts with a self-evaluation from people. How do they see themselves in the track? What examples are there? For the work, for their own assessment. And we feel this really brings people more closer to the framework because they're mostly in control. And we've seen many instances where their manager has learned things they didn't know before, or they were not seeing it in the same light, which ultimately influenced these assessments. So I think, not making it top bottom is something that really helps, with having people engage with the framework. I mean, obviously, ultimately, it's the managers, at the end of the day, we need to decide on something. But having it start from the person itself is really helpful in setting the correct tone, the context, and making sure both folks are aligned in how they're perceiving the work.
Right, so you kick off with a self-assessment so that it's sort of really the team member taking themselves through the framework rather than being dictated to.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Richard, any thoughts on sort of how you get the team on board with the framework? Is it your experience that sort of naturally they're interested in career progression and this provides a guide, or is there some hesitancy that it's just another box ticking exercise that I've got to do and I want to just get back to my IDE and write some code?
I think it's easy to fall into the latter. For me, the transparency around it is really important. So I like having these career frameworks and these career pathways in a place where anyone can go and reference them, even for tracks that aren't theirs. So if as an engineer, I'm totally happy if you want to go and look at the product or the delivery frameworks and those career paths and see how they contrast to yours. And I think that transparency helps people self-calibrate where they're at, where they think they need or would like to grow. And then that brings on the conversation with, hey, I'd really like to pick up on this. I know it's important to me. It's also important in the career framework, which is great. And the conversation with the manager is, what opportunities have I got to go and try this or get involved in this? I think that transparency, I think, really helps with it.
Right, got it. So it can almost be a prompt or an aid for those one-on-ones when you're looking at what can I work on next. And that can just help you come up with some ideas of sort of where you can grow. The next question touches on the evolution of frameworks as they change within a mature organization. And the question is, how do you keep iterating through your career growth framework without moving the goalposts? So how do you avoid that sense of, well, I was working on this thing, but now it says I need to work on that thing? Is this a problem that you've encountered whilst sort of developing a framework that's in use?
I think there's a couple of areas where I can probably relate to this. Actually, one is probably adding one at the top and another is probably adding something at the bottom. So as we've developed our frameworks, as the companies have got bigger that I've worked in, along the bottom of that framework, it's usual that you're a software developer, you tend to start your career with a university degree and then you're in. But actually now we want to encourage more associates to come and join us that maybe don't have that background but still have the aptitude. So how do we adjust our framework and in effect reset the bar at the bottom but do it in a way that doesn't have knock-on impact to the bars above it? And likewise at the top end, I had one where we had an individual contributor framework that worked its way up towards principal roles, and I was keen to have a more sort of a distinguished engineer role at the top of that. So how do I put that in at the top without, in effect, downgrading or degrading those individual contributor tracks in place? I think this is important, where you start to not only work closely with your people team and start working, as Sarah's pointing out, with a group of internal stakeholders who can help stress test or make sure you're doing it right. But also, remember, there are organizations out there that have crossed that hurdle before, that are bigger than you, that have thought this through. I know in Google there's I think it's the Oxygen project, or back of a management competency framework, which, it's useful for someone like me to go and look at that, because there's been thousands of hours of academic and practical research put into that. And I can leverage that to help me make sure that I can realign or stretch my frameworks as the company grows, without impacting some of that stuff in the middle. So I think the message is, don't be afraid to go and ask for help. And there are plenty of examples out there where people have solved or badly solved this before you, and you can learn from that.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And on that note, we are going to wrap up. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for their time today. It's been a really interesting exploration of all the different attributes of creating and deploying frameworks, and all the things that can come up. So you can connect with the speakers and myself on social media. Those links will be shared. And thank you all for joining.